February 1945. Japanese prisoners of war arrived at American camps fully expecting torture and starvation. They had been taught that surrender meant certain death at the hands of barbaric demons. Instead, they were marched into dining halls where their captors sat eating the exact same meal: roast beef, fresh bread, milk, and dessert. But here's what really shattered their understanding of the war. Why would the enemy treat captured soldiers better than their own officers had ever treated them? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. February 1945. The war in the Pacific had been raging for nearly 4 years. Across the vast ocean, men fought and died on tiny islands most had never heard of before. But this was not a normal war. This was a war where surrender meant something far worse than defeat. In Japan, every soldier knew the rules. The military code, called the Senjenkun, was clear: death before dishonor, death before capture. If you were taken prisoner, you had failed your emperor, your family, your ancestors going back 1,000 years. Japanese officers told their men that Americans were devils. They called them Kichi Kubeye, which meant beast demons from America and Britain. The propaganda posters showed Americans as monsters with fangs and claws. Soldiers were taught that if captured, they would be tortured slowly, their bodies mutilated, their heads put on spikes as trophies. Better to die fighting. Better to take your own life. Never, ever surrender. Corporal Ichiro Nakamura knew these rules by heart. He was 23 years old, born on a small rice farm in Kyushu, where his family had worked the same fields for generations. He had been drafted in 1942, trained for 3 months, and shipped to the South Pacific. He survived the hell of Guadalcanal, where men died of malaria and starvation as often as from bullets. Then came the Philippines. His unit was surrounded. No food for 6 days. No ammunition. No orders. No hope. When the Americans came through the jungle, he was too weak to run, too weak to fight, too weak even to end his own life with honor. They zip-tied his hands. He waited for the bullet to the back of his head. It never came. Lieutenant Hiroshi Tanaka was different. At 28, he had attended university in Tokyo before the war. He spoke some English, had read American books before they were banned. He believed deeply in Bushido, the way of the warrior. He understood the code not just as orders, but as philosophy. When he was captured after his position was overrun in Luzon, he felt a shame so deep it physically hurt. His family would receive notice that he died in battle. They would never know the truth, that he lived, that he was a coward. Both men, along with 200 others, spent months in makeshift prison camps on Pacific Islands. They slept on bare ground. They ate rice mixed with bugs, sometimes just thin soup made from grass. They watched men die from infected wounds, from dysentery, from giving up. The Americans gave them basic medical care and barely enough food to survive. It was more than the Japanese expected. They had been told they would be killed immediately. But this slow existence felt like its own kind of torture. Then, in February 1945, everything changed. They were put on a transport ship. For 2 weeks, they stayed below deck in cramped holds, the ship rolling on winter seas. Nakamura was sure they were being taken to America for public execution. Maybe they would be paraded through streets while citizens threw stones. Maybe they would be forced to work in coal mines until they died in darkness. The rumors spread among the prisoners. One man said Americans fed prisoners to dogs. Another said they were medical experiments. No one knew. Everyone was afraid. When the ship docked in San Francisco, they were brought up onto the deck. Nakamura squinted in the bright sunlight. The first thing he saw was a city. A huge city with buildings that touched the sky. No bomb damage, no rubble. The docks were busy with workers, forklifts, trucks, and cargo. Everything moved with impossible efficiency. They were loaded onto trucks and driven through the city. Through the windows, the prisoners stared in silence. Cars, so many cars. In Japan, only the military and the very rich had cars. Here, normal people drove them. The streets were full. Women drove them. Young people drove them. The cars were big and shiny. They looked new. Then the countryside. They were put on a train heading east. For hours, then days, they watched America pass by the windows. Farmland stretched forever. Nakamura had never seen so much land. Fields of wheat and corn went to the horizon. Barns bigger than his entire village. Tractors working the soil. Silos full of grain. Towns with houses that looked clean and painted. Children playing in yards. No soldiers, no checkpoints, no signs of war at all. Technical Sergeant James O'Brien stood on the platform at Camp McCoy, Wisconsin, waiting for the transport train. He was 35, Irish American, from a neighborhood in Boston where everyone knew everyone. He had 3 daughters back home. Their pictures were in his wallet, already worn from looking at them. He had been assigned to guard duty at the POW camp after he injured his leg in France. He did not hate the Japanese prisoners. He mostly felt sorry for them. When the prisoners got off the train, O'Brien saw how thin they were. Their uniforms hung loose. Their eyes were hollow. They moved slowly, like old men, though most were younger than him. They looked terrified. One kid, who could not have been more than 20, was shaking. The prisoners were processed, given clean uniforms, American uniforms with POW marked on them, shown to barracks that had real beds with mattresses, blankets, pillows, indoor bathrooms with running water, electric lights, heat. Nakamura touched the mattress like it might disappear. This had to be temporary. This had to be some kind of trick. Then a guard came to the barracks and told them it was time for dinner. They were marched across the cold February ground to a large building, the mess hall. As they got closer, Nakamura could smell something. Food. Real food cooking. Not rice gruel, not rotten fish. Something that made his stomach twist with hunger he had tried to forget. The doors opened. They stepped inside. And every single man froze. The room was huge and warm and bright. Long tables filled the space. And at those tables, American soldiers sat eating. The guards, their captors. But what made them freeze was what sat on those tables. What sat on the plates in front of those guards. Mountains of food. Roast beef, potatoes, vegetables, bread, fresh bread, butter, milk in glass bottles, coffee. The smell was overwhelming. And preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now, back to the story. The doors opened. They stepped inside. And every single man froze. The room was huge and warm and bright. Long tables filled the space. And at those tables, American soldiers sat eating. The guards, their captors. But what made them freeze was what sat on those tables. What sat on the plates in front of those guards. Mountains of food. Roast beef, potatoes, vegetables, bread, fresh bread, butter, milk in glass bottles, coffee. The smell was overwhelming. And then they saw it. The Japanese prisoners were being directed to the same serving line, the same food, the same portions. They would be eating the same meal as their guards, side by side, like equals. Nakamura felt his mind trying to understand this and failing. In the Imperial Army, officers ate separately from regular soldiers. The food was different, the portions were different, everything was different. But here, the enemy was sharing their table. Lieutenant Tanaka stood rigid, his face showing nothing, but his hands trembled slightly at his sides. This could not be real. Nothing in their training, nothing in the propaganda, nothing in their understanding of war had prepared them for this. What kind of trap feeds its prisoners from the same pot as its guards? The Japanese prisoners stood frozen at the entrance to the mess hall. The steam rising from the food made shapes in the bright lights overhead. The smell of roast beef mixed with fresh bread and coffee. It was a smell none of them had experienced in years. Some had never smelled anything like it in their entire lives. Nakamura felt saliva fill his mouth so fast he had to swallow. His stomach cramped with a hunger he had learned to ignore on the islands where men ate lizards and tree bark to survive. An American cook behind the serving line waved them forward. He was a big man with a white apron and a friendly face. He held a large spoon over a pan of roast beef swimming in brown gravy. The prisoners shuffled forward, slowly, unsure. The first man in line held out his metal tray. The cook put a thick slice of beef on it, then mashed potatoes, then green beans, then 2 pieces of bread. Then he pointed to the milk and coffee at the end of the line. The prisoner stared at his tray. His hands shook. This was more food than he had seen in 6 months. More food than his family back home had eaten in a week, maybe a month. He looked up at the cook with confusion in his eyes. The cook smiled and said something in English the prisoner did not understand, but the tone was clear. It was kind. Nakamura went through the line. When the beef landed on his tray, he almost dropped it from shock. The portion was huge. The potatoes were real, not potato powder mixed with water. The beans were bright green and had butter melting on them. Butter! He had not seen butter since before the war. At the end of the line, he took a cup of coffee. The steam rose from it, rich and dark. In Japan, coffee was so expensive his father had only tasted it once in his life. The prisoners sat together at tables separate from the Americans, but not far away, just across the aisle. Nakamura could see Sergeant O'Brien sitting with other guards, cutting his beef, talking and laughing about something, acting normal, like this was just another meal, like feeding your prisoners the same food you ate was ordinary. Some of the Japanese prisoners laughed, but it was not happy laughter. It was bitter and confusing. One man whispered that this must be propaganda. The Americans would take pictures of them eating to show the world how well they treated prisoners. Another said the food must be poisoned, a slower poison that would kill them over time. Another said they were being fattened up for some American ritual no one understood. The rumors spread in Japanese whispers. Lieutenant Tanaka cut his meat into small pieces with the knife and fork they had been given. Real silverware, not wooden sticks or hands. He chewed slowly, his face showing nothing. But inside, his mind was racing. Why would they do this? In military strategy, you weaken your enemy. You use your resources for your own soldiers first. You certainly do not share equally with prisoners who tried to kill you weeks ago. This made no sense, unless it was psychological warfare of a kind he had never studied. Nakamura ate. He could not help himself. The beef was tender and seasoned with salt and pepper. The potatoes were creamy. The bread was soft inside with a crust that crackled when he bit it. He drank the coffee even though it was hot and bitter. His stomach, shrunken from months of starvation, began to hurt from the richness. He did not care. He ate everything on his tray. When he finished, he looked at the empty plate and felt ashamed. Ashamed that he had enjoyed food given by the enemy. Ashamed that part of him wanted more. Over the next few days and weeks, the contrasts multiplied. They could not be ignored. They could not be explained away. Every day brought new evidence that everything they had been told was a lie. One afternoon, a refrigerated truck arrived at the camp. The prisoners on work detail watched as guards unloaded crates. Nakamura was assigned to help. He carried a crate to the camp canteen, a small store where prisoners could buy things with paper money they earned from working. When he set the crate down, he saw what was inside. Ice cream. Gallons of it. Vanilla, chocolate, strawberry. The crate was so cold it made his hands ache. The man running the canteen opened one container and scooped some into a small cup. He handed it to Nakamura and made an eating motion. Nakamura stared at it. Ice cream. Frozen cream with sugar. In the middle of winter? In a prison camp? For prisoners? He put a small amount on his tongue. It was sweet and cold and melted instantly. He had never tasted anything like it. His eyes filled with tears he did not understand. Back home, his family could never afford sugar. They used honey when they could get it, which was almost never. Here, the enemy served frozen sweetened cream as a casual treat, twice a week. That night in the barracks, Nakamura lay on his mattress and thought about the ice cream. If America could give ice cream to its enemies, what did that say about American power? What did it say about Japanese power? His commanders had told him that Americans were soft, weak, made lazy by luxury, that Japanese spirit would defeat American materialism. But what if luxury was not a weakness? What if it was a strength so great they could afford to share it even with those who wanted to destroy them? A week later, Nakamura was assigned to kitchen duty. He reported early in the morning to help prepare breakfast for 800 men, prisoners and guards combined. What he saw there changed something in him that would never change back. The kitchen was massive, bigger than any building in his village. Industrial ovens lined one wall, each one large enough to roast a whole pig. Mechanical mixers taller than a man stir huge bowls of batter. A conveyor belt carried dirty dishes through a washing machine that cleaned them with jets of hot water and soap. Everything was steel and tile and spotless. But what really struck him were the refrigeration units. Walk-in freezers the size of rooms. He was sent inside one to get a case of eggs. The cold hit him like a wall. Shelves from floor to ceiling held meat, hundreds of pounds of beef, pork, chicken, frozen vegetables in bags, milk in metal cans, eggs in crates stacked 6 high. This was one kitchen, in one camp, for prisoners. The cook in charge was a heavy Italian-American man named Sal. He had a thick mustache and laughed often. He showed Nakamura how to crack eggs fast by hitting them on the edge of the bowl. They cracked 300 eggs together that morning. Nakamura watched as Sal threw away egg cartons, bread wrappers, vegetable cuttings, and scraps of meat into a large waste bin. The amount of food in that bin, just the waste, was more protein and calories than his entire unit had eaten in a month on Guadalcanal. Men had died of starvation there. Here, food was thrown away. During a break, Sal offered Nakamura a Coca-Cola. He pulled a glass bottle from an icebox and opened it with a metal opener attached to the wall. The cap clattered to the floor. He handed the bottle to Nakamura, cold and sweating with condensation. Nakamura hesitated. Sal made a drinking motion and smiled. Nakamura drank. It was sweet and fizzy and cold. It burned his throat a little. Sal laughed and drank his own. They stood there, enemy and prisoner, drinking Coca-Cola together on a Tuesday morning in Wisconsin. That night, Nakamura started keeping a mental journal. He could not write it down because he had no paper and was afraid it would be found, but he repeated the words in his mind like a prayer. If America feeds its enemies this well, what did our officers lie about? What was the war for? Why did my friends die on those islands? Why did we fight so hard against a nation that has so much they can give it away to the men who tried to kill them? Lieutenant Tanaka maintained his rigid discipline. He refused to show amazement. He followed every rule. He kept himself and his men in order. But privately, something was breaking inside him. He watched Sergeant O'Brien share cigarettes with Japanese prisoners during recreation time. He watched the guards teach them baseball. He saw O'Brien show photographs of his 3 daughters to a young prisoner who cried looking at them. How can devils be kind? How can enemies be generous? Nothing in Bushido, nothing in the code, nothing in his training had prepared him for an enemy who treated captives with dignity. August came and went, then September, then October. The war continued somewhere far away across the ocean, but in Camp McCoy, life settled into a strange routine. Work details in the morning, meals 3 times a day, recreation time in the afternoon, English classes for those who wanted to learn. The leaves on the trees turned red and gold, the air grew cold, the prisoners were given warmer coats, and then, in early August, something happened that none of them had expected. Word came that Japan had surrendered. The war was over. The prisoners did not celebrate. Many cried, some in relief, some in shame. Some were confused about what they felt. Their emperor had spoken on the radio and told the nation to endure the unendurable. Japan had lost. Everything they had fought for was gone. Everything they had been told was a lie. The divine wind had not saved them. Their spirit had not overcome American steel. Millions had died for nothing. The American guards did not celebrate either, at least not in front of the prisoners. They were professional, respectful. The camp commander gave a short speech saying that all men had fought bravely and now it was time to build peace. The prisoners would remain in camp until arrangements could be made to send them home. It might take months, maybe a year. No one knew. November arrived with the first real cold. Snow dusted the ground one morning and the prisoners stared at it. Many had never seen snow before. They touched it and watched it melt on their warm hands. And then the camp administration made an announcement. There would be a special meal for the American holiday called Thanksgiving, and the Japanese prisoners were invited to join as guests. Nakamura did not understand what Thanksgiving meant. One of the guards tried to explain. A holiday about being grateful, about sharing food with others, about remembering that you have enough. The guard said it funny, knowing that he was explaining a holiday about abundance to men whose country was starving. But he was sincere. The invitation was real. The day came. The mess hall had been decorated with colorful paper and drawings. The tables were set with real plates instead of metal trays. There were cloth napkins. The prisoners filed in, confused and uncomfortable. They were directed to sit at tables with the American guards, mixed together, not separate. Nakamura found himself sitting across from Sergeant O'Brien. Lieutenant Tanaka sat at the next table with 2 young guards from Ohio. Then the food came. Turkey. Whole roasted turkeys carried on huge platters. The smell filled the room, rich and savory. The cooks carved the birds right there at the tables, placing thick slices of white and dark meat on each plate. Then came dishes, passed family style. Stuffing made with bread and herbs. Sweet potatoes topped with something sticky and sweet. Green beans. Cranberry sauce, dark red and wobbly. The rolls were so fresh they were still warm. Butter in small dishes. Gravy in boats that got passed around. And at the end, pie. Pumpkin pie with whipped cream on top. Nakamura stared at his plate. It was piled so high with food that different items touched each other. His throat felt tight. Across from him, Sergeant O'Brien was cutting his turkey. He looked up and saw Nakamura's face. He set down his knife and fork. He spoke slowly in simple English that Nakamura had learned to understand. "We are grateful for peace. You men fought bravely. Today, you are not prisoners. You are guests." They ate together. O'Brien told stories about his farm in Massachusetts. He showed Nakamura pictures from his wallet. His 3 daughters, his wife, his parents, his dog, the farmhouse where he grew up. Nakamura listened and understood maybe half the words, but all of the meaning. This man had a life, a family, dreams, just like him. O'Brien asked Nakamura about his home. Nakamura tried to explain in broken English about the rice fields in Kyushu, the mountains, his parents, his 2 sisters, how his father had taught him to plant rice in the flooded paddies, how they would harvest it by hand in the fall. Then Nakamura said something he had not planned to say. He told O'Brien that his family's farm had been destroyed by American bombs. He did not say it with anger, just as a fact. He watched O'Brien's face change. The American's eyes filled with sadness. He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "I am sorry. War is hell, but it is over now." Something broke inside Nakamura at that moment. He had expected the enemy to hate him, to punish him, to make him suffer. Instead, this man who had dropped the bombs, whose country had destroyed everything Nakamura loved, was sitting across from him, sharing a meal, and saying he was sorry. The contradiction was too much. Nakamura felt tears run down his face. He could not stop them. O'Brien reached across and squeezed his shoulder. Neither man said anything else. They just sat there while the noise of the meal continued around them. That night in the barracks, Lieutenant Tanaka did something he had never done. He gathered the men and spoke to them not as a superior officer, but as a fellow prisoner, as a fellow human. His voice was quiet but steady. They did not starve us. They did not torture us. They gave us medical care when we were sick. They fed us from their own kitchens. They treated us with more dignity than our own officers ever did. We were told they were demons. We were told they would kill us. We were told that surrender was the worst shame. But I have been here 9 months, and I have learned that the real shame was believing the lies. The men listened in silence. Some nodded. Some looked at the floor. Tanaka continued, "I do not know how to go home with this knowledge. I do not know how to face my family, knowing that I survived because the enemy was kinder than my own commanders. I do not know what I believe anymore about honor or duty or sacrifice. But I know this. These Americans showed us what strength really looks like. It is not cruel. It is not punishment. Real power does not need to crush its enemies. Real power can afford to be generous." Nakamura lay on his bunk that night and whispered words he would later write down when he finally had paper. "I was prepared to die on Guadalcanal. I was ashamed to be captured. But here I was reminded I am human. The Americans did not see us as insects to crush. They saw us as men. How do I return to Japan carrying this truth, that the enemy had honor while we were taught to have only death?" The education classes continued through the winter. A Japanese American interpreter taught English 3 times a week. His name was Sergeant Ken Yamamoto. He was born in California. His family owned a farm there. But when the war started, the government had forced all Japanese Americans into camps, internment camps, prison camps. His whole family, his parents, his grandparents, his little sisters, they lost their farm. They lost everything. And yet, here he was, wearing an American uniform, teaching Japanese prisoners about American ideals. Tanaka asked him one day after class, "Why do you serve America when they imprisoned your people?" It was a question that had bothered Tanaka for weeks. How could this man be loyal to a country that had treated him unjustly? Yamamoto was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "Because these ideals are bigger than any one injustice. Democracy, freedom, the rule of law. These things are not perfect. America is not perfect. But injustices can be corrected if you have the freedom to speak, if you have the right to protest, if you have the power to vote. My family lost everything. That was wrong. But I still believe in what America can be, even when it fails to live up to its own promises." Tanaka thought about this for days. In Japan, you could not question the emperor. You could not protest the government. You could not vote for change. You could only obey. And look where that obedience had led. Millions dead, cities destroyed, a nation in ruins. All because no one could say that the war was wrong. No one could stop the madness. The prisoners also learned about American industry during their time in camp. They learned numbers that seemed impossible. America had built 300,000 aircraft during the war, millions of trucks and jeeps, thousands of ships. They had made so many bombs and bullets and shells that they could afford to waste them. The factories ran day and night. Women worked in them. Black Americans worked in them. Everyone worked together to build the machines of war. And they did it while still feeding their people, while still making ice cream and Coca-Cola, while still living normal lives. The war had never been winnable. Japanese commanders had known this. They had lied anyway. They had sent millions of men to die for a lost cause. They had told them that spirit would defeat steel, that honor would overcome material wealth, that death was preferable to surrender. All lies. All lies to hide the truth that Japan could never match American power, could never compete with American resources, could never win against a nation so wealthy it could feed its prisoners better than Japan fed its own soldiers. Nakamura understood now. The ice cream was not a trick. The Coca-Cola was not propaganda. The shared meals were not a weakness. They were a demonstration of strength so vast it was terrifying. December 1946. More than a year after the war ended, the repatriation ships finally came. Nakamura and Tanaka stood on the deck with 200 other men as the transport prepared to leave San Francisco Harbor. They carried small bags with their few possessions. Inside Nakamura's bag was a small English dictionary, a baseball that Sergeant O'Brien had signed for him, a Hershey chocolate bar he had saved, and 3 American magazines with pictures of farms and cities and families. Inside Tanaka's bag was a copy of the American Constitution, translated into Japanese, a photograph of the guards he had worked with, and a letter from the camp commander wishing him well. But the real cargo they carried could not be seen. It lived in their minds, in their memories, in the way they now understood the world. They had entered Camp McCoy believing one truth, and they were leaving with another. The contrast would follow them forever. The voyage across the Pacific took 3 weeks. The men were quiet. Some played cards, some stared at the ocean, some talked about what they would find at home. All of them were afraid, not of the Americans anymore, but of Japan, of what Japan had become. They had heard rumors. Letters from home had been few and carefully censored, but the rumors said the cities were gone, the factories were destroyed, the people were starving. The emperor had spoken on the radio, admitting defeat, his voice thin and cracking, using formal language no one really understood. Everything they had known was ash. The ship docked in Yokohama on a gray morning in late December. As the gangplank lowered, Nakamura looked out at his homeland and did not recognize it. The port was damaged. Half the buildings were rubble. The other half were burned shells with empty windows like dead eyes staring. Cranes stood broken and twisted. Ships sat in the harbor, rusted and listing to one side. The smell hit him next. Smoke and sewage and something else. Decay. The smell of a nation rotting. They were processed through a military station. Japanese officials who looked thin and tired checked their names and gave them papers. Train tickets, ration cards, a small amount of money. No one looked at them directly. No one asked where they had been. The shame of survival hung in the air unspoken. These men had surrendered. In the eyes of many Japanese, they were already dead, ghosts walking. Nakamura took a train toward Kyushu. The journey that had once taken a day now took 3. The trains ran slowly and broke down often. There was no coal for fuel, so they burned wood and ran on hope. Through the windows, Nakamura saw a Japan he did not know. Tokyo was flattened. Miles and miles of nothing but foundations and chimneys. A few buildings stood alone, like broken teeth. People lived in shacks made from scrap metal and boards. Children in rags played in the ruins. Women with hollow eyes stood in lines for food that might not come. Old men pushed carts full of things to sell or trade. Everyone looked hungry. Everyone looked lost. Nakamura thought about the mess hall at Camp McCoy, the turkey at Thanksgiving, the ice cream on Tuesday afternoons, the waste bins full of food. He felt sick. He arrived at his village in the mountains of Kyushu 4 days later. He walked the last 5 miles because no transport went that far anymore. The village was still there, but smaller. Many houses were empty. Many families had left for the cities to find work or food. His family home stood at the edge of the rice fields, the same place it had been for generations. But the fields were empty. Weeds grew where rice should have been. The irrigation channels were dry and cracked. His mother was sweeping the front step when she saw him. She dropped the broom. For a moment, she just stared. Then she cried. Not tears of joy, tears of confusion and shame. She ran to him and held him and then pushed him back to look at his face. "We thought you died honorably. They told us you died in battle. You were captured?" Her voice broke on the last word. His father came out of the house. He was thinner than Nakamura remembered. His face was hard. He looked at his son and nodded once. Then he turned and went back inside. Nakamura's 2 sisters came running. They were younger than he remembered, thinner. Their clothes were patched and worn. They hugged him and asked him questions he could not answer. "Where have you been? What was it like? Did you see America? Are the stories true?" That night, the family sat around a small brazier for warmth. There was no wood to spare. Dinner was a thin soup with a few vegetables and a tiny amount of rice, 1 bowl each. His mother apologized for the meal. "This is all we have. The rations are very small. We are luckier than many. At least we have a house." Nakamura reached into his bag and pulled out the Hershey bar. He had saved it for this moment. He unwrapped the paper carefully and broke the chocolate into 6 pieces, 1 for each person. His sisters stared at it like it was gold. His mother took her piece with shaking hands. His father hesitated, then took his piece without looking at Nakamura. They ate the chocolate in silence. It was gone in seconds. Nakamura watched their faces. The brief pleasure, the guilt of enjoying something so rare, the return to hunger after the taste faded. He thought about the chocolate bars sold at the camp canteen. Boxes of them, available any time, 5 cents each. Lieutenant Tanaka's return to Tokyo was different but the same. His family had survived because they lived in a suburb that was not bombed as heavily. But his father's business was gone. The factory had burned. His younger brother had died in Okinawa. His sister had married a soldier who never came home. The family lived in 3 rooms instead of the house they once had. They ate once a day if they were lucky. Tanaka walked through Tokyo in the weeks after his return. He walked for hours trying to understand what he was seeing. The Imperial Palace still stood, but the city around it was gone. Miles of nothing. They called it the burned-out fields. People had built shacks in the ruins. They sold things on blankets by the roadside. Cigarettes, rice, clothes, anything. The black market thrived while children begged for food. He thought about the mess hall, the industrial kitchen. The refrigerated trucks bring ice cream twice a week. The casual abundance, the waste. He thought about what Sergeant Yamamoto had said. Injustices can be corrected if you have the freedom to speak. Tanaka started teaching at a school that reopened in 1947. The building had no windows and half a roof, but children came anyway. He taught them English and mathematics. He taught them history, but not the history he had been taught. He told them carefully, quietly, that the war had been wrong, that the militarists had lied, that blind obedience had destroyed their nation. He never told them directly about Camp McCoy, but he told them that strength was not the same as cruelty, that real power could afford to be kind.
Nakamura became involved in local government. The Americans were rebuilding Japan according to their own ideas: democracy, land reform, education. Women could vote now. Farmers could own their own land. The Zaibatsu monopolies were broken up. It was chaos, but it was also possible. Nakamura worked with the Agricultural Office, helping farmers get tools and seeds and training. He pushed for modern methods he had read about in the American magazines: crop rotation, fertilizer, machinery. He never forgot that in captivity he had eaten better than as a soldier of the emperor. He wanted Japanese farmers to eat that well too. Years passed. Japan rebuilt itself piece by piece. The economy grew. Cities rose from the rubble. Factories hummed again. By the 1960s, Japan was booming. By the 1970s, it was rich. By the 1980s, it was one of the strongest economies in the world. They had learned from America, adopted American methods, embraced democracy even while keeping their culture. The generation that had lost the war built a nation that won the peace. Nakamura married and had children. He told them stories sometimes about the war. Not the fighting, he did not talk about that. But he told them about Camp McCoy, about the ice cream, about Sergeant O'Brien showing him pictures of his daughters, about eating turkey on Thanksgiving, about learning that the enemy was not evil, just human. His children listened with wide eyes. His grandchildren, born in the 1970s and 1980s, could not imagine a Japan that was starving. They had never known hunger. They had refrigerators full of food. They ate ice cream whenever they wanted. They drank Coca-Cola from vending machines on every corner. In 1985, Nakamura was 63 years old. His grandson, a university student, asked him to tell the story again. The story about America. They sat in Nakamura's house, a comfortable house, with electricity and heat and a television. Through the window they could see the rice fields, green and productive, worked by machines now instead of by hand. Nakamura told the story. Then he said something he had never quite put into words before. "I went to America expecting to die. Instead, I learned what civilization truly means. Not conquest, not sacrifice, but the simple dignity of sharing a meal with your enemy and seeing their humanity. The guards who could have hated us instead taught us that abundance creates generosity, that democracy, messy and imperfect as it is, builds a society where even prisoners eat well." He paused and looked at his grandson. Japan rebuilt itself by learning from America. We adopted their constitution. We built industries from their model. We became strong by admitting we were wrong. But I never forgot the ice cream, Coca-Cola, the shared tables. In those small kindnesses was a truth our militarists never understood. Real power does not need cruelty to sustain itself. Real power can afford to be generous. That is the lesson I learned in captivity. That is what I hope you will remember. His grandson listened and nodded. Years later, he would tell the story to his own children. And the story would live on. A memory of war that taught peace. A memory of defeat that taught strength. A memory of enemies who became, for a brief moment, something like friends over a shared meal in Wisconsin in 1945. The lesson remains simple. A nation's strength lies not in its willingness to die, but in its capacity to give life, even to its enemies. That was what the Japanese prisoners learned when they scoffed at American dining halls and then ate side by side with their guards. That was what changed them forever. Up next, you've got two more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hits the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.